I want to step back one step before I begin our discussion to sort of give you a sense of this, because most of you who have not been involved in philosophy would probably think that issues like right and wrong, good and bad, ought to have clear meanings. If you want to know what they are, just ask me, I'll tell you. Okay, right? But the fact of the matter is that their meanings very often, are very much influenced by your perspective. If you think of the word religion, the L-I-G in the word religion comes from the same Latin root from which we get the word ligament. What's a ligament? Yes, connective tissue. Same Latin root. Sometimes when a woman has as many children as she wants, she has her tubes tied. That's called a tubal ligation. Right. The L-I-G is in the middle of the word religion because among the things that religions do is that they give you a picture of who you are as an individual and who you are in all your connections to your family, to your local Jewish community, to the larger community, to the environment, and to the transcendent element of human experience, which we in the Western world image as God, imaged in other ways in the Eastern world, in Asia. And what each of the religions does is it gives you a picture of who you are individually and in all these connections, and also what kind of a person you should strive to be, and what kind of a community you should strive to create. And all of the specific moral norms, do you abort or don't you abort? How do you balance issues of academic freedom and academic integrity and truth? How do you deal with how many is enough to set aside capital punishment? How many innocent people convicted on death row is enough? Those kinds of specific questions are rooted in the big pictures that the various religions of the world create. And it's not just the religions of the world, it's also the secular philosophies of the world, Western liberalism, communism, existentialism. And as American Jews, we inherit two pictures, the American picture and the Jewish picture, which sometimes overlap, but sometimes don't. And they certainly don't in their fundamental convictions. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What am I quoting? The Declaration of Independence, that's right. Jefferson cribbed that from Locke. Locke had said 100 years earlier or so, Locke had said life, liberty, and property, and Jefferson changed that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can imagine how many doctoral dissertations have been written about that. But as an American, I am an individual with rights. The central Jewish story is what we just celebrated on Passover, Exodus and Sinai. We leave Egypt not as individuals, we leave as a community, and we get to Sinai and don't get a single right. We get 613 obligations, commandments. That's the beginning of Jewish guilt. It's also the beginning of seeing ourselves as members of a community with duties, as opposed to individuals with rights. Now, sometimes duties and rights are reciprocal. If I have a duty to you, that might establish a right within you. But that's not always the case, and it certainly is a very different thing if you get up in the morning and you are an individual with rights, and so the world owes you, as opposed to getting up in the morning and you're a member of a community with duties, and so you have a mission in life to do something for the world. And so these two pictures, the American picture and the Jewish picture, that every American Jew tries to balance throughout his or her life, start with very different presumptions, and they lead to sometimes at least, they lead to very different conclusions. I'm going to start with Dr. Rosner. You had talked about several different ways in which you thought that American secular ethics on medicine is different from Jewish ethics on medicine. One of them was in regard to professional secrecy. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. Before I get to that, I would like to respond to one comment that you made about abortion and how the Catholic ethics differs from Jewish ethics. In Catholicism, abortion is never allowed under any circumstances, even if both lives, both the mother and the baby's life, are at stake, because can't take a human life, right? And that goes for even a 10-week-old fetus in the mother's womb. It's already a life. Life begins at conception. Yeah. Obviously, in Judaism, that is not the case. Judaism requires an abortion, not only allows it, but mandates it if the mother's life is at stake from that unborn fetus. The Mishnah even goes as far as to say, with gruesome language, that if the mother is on the birth stool, she's in the delivery room, and she's about to give birth, and this baby is endangering her life, then one dismembers this fetus limb by limb, this embryo. That's an embryotomy. It's not even an abortion anymore, in order to save the mother's life. So
Which in
the
turn,
value of human life, again, takes precedence over everything, and the saving of a human life, as I mentioned before. Now, secrecy is...
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
Which in turn, the Catholic view of ethics versus the Jewish view of ethics versus the American secular view of ethics, as the Supreme Court has delineated, at least as of this moment,
Right.
is that it's part of the woman's body and
Roe
she has a
versus
right
Wade.
over it. That's right, Roe v. Wade and Casey decision and so on. That it's part of her body and she has a right to it, to abort it basically at will, with states having some right toward the end of pregnancy to impose certain restrictions. So there you got a very good example, actually, of three very different lenses. The Catholic lens on what happens, by the way, I assume you understand that when a Catholic couple has sexual intercourse and conceives, when a Jewish couple has sexual intercourse and conceives, when a secular American couple has sexual intercourse and conceives, medically the same thing's going on. Right? So it's a function of the perception that's going on, right? It's a question of your lens. And with abortion, you have a very good example of three very different lenses, the Catholic, the Jewish, and the American secular lens, that lead to very different results. Right. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
You mentioned a Bill of Rights and so on. Rabbi Jacobowitz clearly stated once that the Ten Commandments are not a Bill of Rights. There are duties and obligations, and we lose sight of that. Everybody is concerned with privacy, autonomy, individual rights, and so on, but very few people speak about the opposite of that, the corollary, namely that in addition to rights, yes, you have rights, but you also have duties and obligations towards yourself, towards your community, towards society, towards God. And in fact, the Jewish view is that it's not a woman's body to do with as she pleases. It's not her body. It's God's body given to her on loan for the duration of her life to use, but not to abuse. So that's a totally different perspective, I think. And now, the secrecy, yes, Judaism requires that a physician or a family member withhold information from a patient who is deathly ill if the result of the divulgence of that information might make the patient be miyayish or despair and get worse or have a nervous breakdown and so on. Again, the value of human life and the sanctity of human life and the infinite value of human life really takes precedence over everything else. So if the secrecy is required in order to help the patient, then by all means, then you keep a secret.
May I just add to that? I love your concept that God lends you your body, and Judaism has had a struggle with that, as you know, when it comes to the concept of organ donation. About 5 or 6 years ago, my dear friend, probably a dear friend of everybody on this panel, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, lost his son tragically in a biking accident. He was married to my first cousin. His brother was married to my first cousin. We were very, very close to them. And the first thing that Yitz did is he got on a plane, went to Israel, and donated all of his beloved son's organs to Christians, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, and started a major campaign emphasizing the need under halacha, the need under Jewish law, to regard your organs as on loan and available for use by others in the concept of pikuach nefesh. That wasn't always the Jewish view. There were times in history, and right now within Muslim traditions, there is a very selfish view. Namely, you can take an organ from another person, but you can't give an organ. And then there were periods of time when you could give an organ, but only to a member of your own religion, but take an organ from a member of any religion. And I think that Israel has now become one of the leading countries in the world on organ donation. It's going to become the first country in the world to adopt the view that I published 10 years ago to much, much criticism. I got blasted when I wrote this. I wrote in a book that you should not be allowed to be an organ recipient unless you are an organ donor, or at the very least, your place on the organ recipient list should be influenced by whether or not you're an organ donor. And I got tremendous criticism for that. And now Israel is in the process of adopting an approach that comes at least very close to that. America is way, way, way behind on that. In most countries in the world, most European countries and other countries, you are presumptively an organ donor unless you opt out. In the United States, you are presumptively not an organ donor unless you opt in. I personally believe it is the height of immorality not to be an organ donor. And there is no justification for it. And I'd be interested if anybody in this audience could make the case for why you should not be an organ donor. I don't think there's a defensible moral case for that under Jewish law or under American secular law.
We're talking about a cadaveric organ donor. We're not talking about a living organ donor. A living organ donor,
I'm talking about only
Okay.
after you die.
Cadaveric
Right,
organs.
only after you die.
But
No,
I would support that with a tshuva by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, which says that it's a mitzvah, that's the word he uses, a mitzvah to donate organs because you're saving other people's lives. And again, the saving of life takes precedence over everything. Again, it's not one of the 613 commandments, but mitzvah means it's a meritorious act. It's a wonderful, altruistic thing to do, and therefore, if Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says it, it's good enough for me.
There's a tshuva of Rabbi Joseph Prauser, approved by the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which says it's a mitzvah in the stronger sense, namely that it actually is a requirement for Jews to do this upon their to allow their organs to be used for donating to for transplantation into people who need them. Why? Because if you don't do it, especially with kidneys, for example, then that will mean that living people who are relatives will feel the pressure to donate their organs. And even though, yes, donating your kidney is something that a lot of people who are alive have done and have lived full lives thereafter, still, that's obviously a much more risky thing than taking a kidney from a cadaver.
Do you know about the famous first case? It occurred in Massachusetts General Hospital. So there were two twin boys, 7 years old. One of them had kidney failure. The other one was a perfect match. And the parents, of course, signed to have the kidney from one alive child donated to the other, and the hospital refused to do it. And the court refused to do it, saying that a parent cannot sign a consent form for surgery on a child unless it would be in the best interest of that child, not in the best interest of the family unit, not in the best interest of the twins, but in the best interest of that child. And you couldn't make the case, the hospital said, supported by the lower court, that signing to give the healthy donor giving away one of his kidneys is in the medical best interest of that child. And a number of Jewish groups filed briefs in that case, and the court adopted the view of one of the Jewish briefs and said, no, you're defining the best interest of the child far too narrowly. This child will live a much better life knowing that he has donated and allowed his brother to live. And that was the first case in America allowing kidney donation. And what a brilliant analysis that the court made to allow that to go forward.
Okay, what I'd like to do now is when you have these different lenses, they are different not only in the content of what they say. So we had some examples of how the Jewish lens is different from the American lens and the Catholic lens on abortion, how they're different on issues of professional secrecy and on issues of transplant. But the differences are not only differences of content, they're also differences of methodology. So, for example, let's just because Jews tend to think that the whole world is Jewish and that everybody does it the way we do it. If you are a Catholic and you have a moral question, you ultimately, you go to your priest, and ultimately, if the priest doesn't know, the priest goes to the bishop, the cardinal, ultimately to the Pope, right? And there are some advisory commissions in the Vatican for the Pope, but ultimately, according to the First Vatican Council in 1871, if the Pope sits on his papal seat ex cathedra, then he is infallible in issues of faith and morals, okay? If you're a Protestant, then it's a whole different thing. Then the whole idea of protesting was protesting the Catholic institutional structure, and it's supposed to be your individual conscience, guided by the Bible and guided to a certain extent by the tradition of your church, but ultimately it's your individual conscience that decides what is the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do. In our tradition, as Dr. Rosner was talking about, one of the major ways in which we make decisions is through Jewish law. It's not the only way we make decisions. There are narratives that are very much part of our tradition and that get used sometimes in the framing of the law. A Yale law professor, Alav Shalom, Robert Cover, wrote a wonderful article a long time ago called Nomos and Narrative, in which he talks about the interactions between narrative and law, because law doesn't exist in a kind of Platonic realm by itself on some deserted island. It very much comes out of the experiences of the people that are supposed to live by it and the people who are setting it. But law is the primary way that we Jews deal with moral issues, and it has some real advantages and it has some disadvantages. So let's talk first of all about what some of the disadvantages are of using law to determine moral issues. How would you like to do that first?
Who are you asking?
Yeah, I'm asking you.
Oh, me, okay. Well, first, a word about nomos and narrative, because it's an important contextual introduction. I went to yeshiva and I love Rashi, but there's no more benighted Rashi than the first one. The first Rashi is just so wrong because it fails to understand the role of narrative. The first Rashi, to the word Bereshit, Rashi asks the question, why is this book of laws, the Bible, starting with stories about the creation? It should start with the first mitzvah, which really appears late in Genesis or early in Exodus. It's a great question, and he gives an absolutely foolish answer. You'll pardon my heresy. He says, and he's quoting Rabbi Israel, he's quoting others, and he says, the reason is because if anybody questions the Jewish claim to Eretz Yisrael, we'll be able to say God created the universe, and therefore, I actually told that story to Bibi Netanyahu, and he's used it now. It's a great propaganda piece for Israel, but it so fails to understand the brilliance and profoundness of the question. The greatest contribution that Jews made to law is narrative. That is, you cannot most rules, the Code of Hammurabi starts with thou shalt not, thou shalt not. We don't get the shouts and shalt nots until the book of Exodus, until you get through the whole common law first. The stories, the imperfections of human beings, the efforts of people to cope without law. And if you think of the Ten Commandments, every one of them relates to a story of failure in the first book, in the book of Genesis. Why do we have a commandment that says thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor? Because we have a story of Joseph being the victim of a false witness being charged. You can go through every one of the Ten Commandments and you find narrative. And the reason that narrative is so crucial is narrative is experience. And narrative allows the lawmaker to say, because. And Jewish Bible is the only book that has because. Do this because. Be kind to strangers because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It is not just rules. It's rules with explanations. It's rules rooted in experience, rooted in history. It's the beginning of democracy. The beginning of democracy requires an explanation. Even God has to explain why you do things. Now, there are chukim in the Bible, too, which God doesn't explain. Maybe that's just a test of faith. But most of the rules come with historical explanations. And so I think it's so critical why Bereshit comes before Shemot and why we intersperse Vayikra with Devarim and all of that. It explains so brilliantly why Jewish law has endured. And I think on balance, the fact that Jewish decision-making has to be made through the process of law, that it transcends a particular case, that you have to look at it as part of a structure, is a very important contribution, and on balance, much preferable to a person whether it be a king or a pope or a rabbi in the Hasidic tradition or other traditions, telling you what's right or what's wrong, or doing it on your own. In Judaism, you got to work it through. It's not simple. You have to balance considerations. I think it's part of the pragmatism of Judaism, and on the one hand, on the other hand. Why does the Torah say, Zedek, Zedek, tirdof? Why do we have two justices? Well, because there are many definitions of justice. It doesn't, by the way, when you talk about injustice, there's only one word for it, because we all know what an injustice is. But we're not so sure what justice is. Reasonable people can disagree. So I very much like the way that Judaism has to work it through principles and rules.
I do too. I am, after all, chair of the Committee on Law and Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Movement. I've written about 20 different shuvot, rabbinic rulings, so I certainly love it. But I think one has to recognize the fact that our way of dealing with moral issues through law has a lot of advantages, which in the end I think outweigh the disadvantages. But I think you can't see that unless you see the disadvantages first. Every way of doing it is going to have its issues, right? Because we're talking about human beings here. No human being is omniscient, knows everything, right? So every way of thinking about morality is going to have its problems. So let's try to spell out what are the problems of doing it by law. Go ahead, Dr. Rosner, do you want to?
I just wanted to add a comment to your characterization of a good Catholic who has a question, goes to the bishop, and if the bishop doesn't have it, it goes to the Pope. We in Judaism don't need an intermediary to communicate with God. We have a direct line to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, prayer, rabbinical consultation, legal consultation if required, medical consultation if required, that gets us answers directly. So good medical treatment, a good medical diagnosis, followed by good rabbinical advice, yes, operate, don't operate, and so on, and if needed, legal advice. So we, as I say, are very different from Catholics in that regard. We have a direct line to God.
Okay, we have three people who are very committed to Jewish law, you can see here. But all right, so let me spell out a few, just to be completely honest, okay? One of the problems with dealing with morality in terms of law is that law sometimes takes time. Law is inherently conservative with a small c, and sometimes takes time to catch up to new realities, to new moral sensitivities and the like. So sometimes what the law says seems to be flatly immoral, and it takes a while for the law to be changed. Another problem with law is that law is, by and large, general, right? It's dealing, unless you do case law, the way the Anglo-American system does it. On the European continent, it's primarily codes as opposed to cases, and the kind of reasoning is very different. And so the question then becomes, yes, you use analogies, you use distinctions, but are the analogies and are the distinctions worth what they claim to be worth? And in the end, aren't you really interpreting those analogies or non-analogies ultimately yourself, and therefore doesn't it ultimately become just your opinion if you happen to be the judge? You have to give reasons for it. That's what makes it something less than arbitrary. One other issue with law, as a way of dealing with it, is that it's general. It intends to give you a rule for at least most cases. But there are a lot. Human life isn't like that. Human life includes all kinds of factors in every single case, and so the way that the laws frame the case may not be the most apt way to do it. On the other hand, what law gives you is, especially in the case-based system, the way that Anglo-American law is based and the way the Jewish law is based, is that you are able to pay attention to details, you are able to analyze completely new cases. So I'll give you one example of this. In 1999, when embryonic stem cell research was first, when embryonic stem cells were first isolated, one by James Thompson at the University of Wisconsin and by John Gerhardt at Hopkins, I was on a project of the American Association for the Advancement of Science on stem cells, well, on genetics generally, but on stem cells in particular. And so Rabbi Castle Abelson, who was at that time the chair of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, asked me to write a tshuva for it, and he wanted it quickly because he knew that rabbis wanted some kind of guidance on this. So this was during the summer of 1999, and we had a subcommittee meeting by conference call. The first meeting at which this whole thing was going to be discussed was December. And then, typical to our process, there would be, on the basis of the discussion, some changes, and then we would vote at the next meeting, which was going to be in March of 2000. In January of 2000, I got a call from a reporter and said, I understand that you're the one writing the tshuva on embryonic stem cell research for the conservative movement. When do you think it will be ready? When will you have a decision? I said, in March. And he said, unbelievable. I just talked to the Presbyterians, it's going to take 5 years. Because see, if it's an individual choice, then the only way in which they can come to a decision is by collective conscience. And that takes a long time to emerge. So one of the advantages of law is that it can be very specific, and it can respond to things fairly quickly if it has to. Let me move to a different issue.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
Anglo-Saxon law is a law where the general rule is promulgated, which an individual judge at a later time has to apply to a specific case that comes before him. Jewish law is just the opposite. Jewish law is case law. The rabbis sometimes make up theoretical cases in order to illustrate the halachic point, and then the rabbi in a future generation then has to apply those general principles to the case at hand. And Jewish law also has law on precedence. In other words, every one of the rabbinic responsa writes all the previous rabbinic responsa that dealt with that same subject. And so there I agree with you that it takes time for the law to evolve, but that's in the Jewish system. Yeah, the legal system, I think Professor Dershowitz can speak to much better than I can.
Well, it's a mixed system. We have both statutory law and common law. If we think of a problem in advance and we know it's going to happen, we generally will pass statutes that regulate it, and then the court has to apply the statute to a particular case, has to measure the statute against the Constitution. But there are going to be many instances, like with the development of the internet, where there were no laws on the books. And I got a lot of cases like that. I'm now representing WikiLeaks in the case in England. There's no law governing that. We have to look to precedent. We have to look broadly to statutes and expect that we can find general precedents that apply. And it's very daunting and very challenging because sometimes you just can't find a precedent. And the judge then has enormous authority to state a first opinion, but that opinion may not endure over time. It may not survive the test of time. As Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, unknowingly quoting Abarbanel 500 years earlier, Justice Holmes said, the life of the law has been experience, not logic. Abarbanel had written many years earlier that logic, experience is more powerful than logic, and we know that all the law has to look to experience to validate itself over time. But just one more comment on the first point. The law understands emergencies and often allows you to act in an emergency status and then justify your conduct after the fact as reasonable. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, you don't expect rationality in the presence of an uplifted knife. And you just have to act and do the right thing, and then the law will judge you based on the experiences that you face. So it can be quick. It can happen quickly. It can happen slowly. Sometimes slowness is a virtue as well. And I'm not here to justify all of law. I spend most of my time criticizing law. But as the lawyer on the panel, I have to at least make the case for law.
Okay.
Just one quickie point on the embryonic stem cell research. In Judaism, it says, be fruitful and multiply and conquer nature. V'chivshuha. Conquer nature. What does conquer nature mean? So the rabbis explained that it means study nature as much as you can and use nature in order to help better human society, find cures for illness and disease. And embryonic stem cell research would certainly be permissible in Judaism. We have 613 commandments, and thou shalt not clone is not one of them.
And of course, Israel is now one of the leading countries in stem cell research because many American researchers have now gone to Israel to do research under circumstances. In fact, I have a dear friend who's a Lubavitch Chassid with a long beard, never went to public secular high school, never went to secular college, has started one of the most important stem cell research companies in the world. He's a real Eloi, a brilliant guy named Chaim Lebovitz. And his company, Brainstorm, has been enormously innovative, and he couldn't do it in America. He could only do it in Israel because he uses stem cell lines that would not be permissible in this country.
Okay, Paul asked me to ask both of you to sum up if you'd like to. So, if you will, let's go in reverse order. Or maybe let's go in the order we went before. Go ahead, Rabbi. Dr. Rosner.
Well, my area is Jewish medical ethics. And the bottom line in Jewish medical ethics is that Judaism considers human life to be of supreme value, holy, sanctity, and everything must be done to preserve human life and to prolong human life. And in order to do so, one may set aside all biblical and rabbinic commandments. That's how high, and this is far greater, the value of human life in Judaism than in many other systems, including Catholicism, where there's a relative value to each.
There's an expression that says the struggle for justice never stays won. It's never a static situation, and being a Jew, everybody understands that. Being a Jew means you can never just heave a sigh of relief and say, it's over, we're at peace, people love us. I actually wrote a book some years ago, mistakenly thinking maybe that had happened. Maybe anti-Semitism was really ending. Maybe the hatred for Israel was kind of on the way out. Boy, was I wrong. And I think the struggle for ethics never stays won. There are no perfect solutions. A utopia is impossible. Dystopia, we've seen it. We know it can happen. We all know what injustice, we know what lack of ethics looks like. We know what lack of morality looks like. The perfect system of ethics, the perfect system of morality and justice, we'll never be able to define. And what I am thrilled about being a Jew, it's the luckiest thing in the world, notwithstanding all the tsuris, to have been born into the Jewish tradition, is it constantly forces you to struggle with the most existential issues, whether you're a strictly observant Jew, an Orthodox Jew, a conservative Jew. I am the faculty advisor at Harvard to Chabad, to Harvard Hillel, to Harvard Jewish Law Students Association, and to the Harvard Humanist Society, which are basically atheists and agnostic Jews. My attitude is, if you want to be a Jew, I want you to be a Jew on whatever terms you want to be a Jew. And you're going to have to struggle with all of these issues. And being a Jew means struggling. And being an ethical Jew means always struggling with ethics. And one more final word. If all medical ethicists were as life-loving and as positive as you are, I think it would contribute enormously to the world. Your emphasis on life and the quality of life and longevity is so much to be admired, and I'm so happy that you find it within the Jewish tradition.
I guess I get a minute also. I just wanted to I hope that people, first of all, appreciate it tonight, that we were talking about, that we were talking about issues at the very core of our being as Jews. That this whole issue of seeking to do the right thing, first of all, trying to figure out what the right thing is in the circumstance at hand and in general, and then finding the wherewithal to do it both in ourselves and in the society generally, that's really at the core of of who we are as Jews. And the way in which we think about it and the content of our thoughts are not the same as those that come with different lenses. And consequently, the more that you study people, Diana Eck from Harvard has this wonderful line, if you know only one religion, you know none. Okay, so if you think that everybody else thinks the way we do, then you can't possibly appreciate the tradition that we have inherited. It is indeed a wonderful heritage, and I hope you got a sense of that tonight.